That'll do. Hey everybody, welcome to yet another episode of ŋa. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to write phonological rules. I've been requested this several times. I mentioned it briefly in one of my Conlanging 101 shorts, and people have been saying that they wanted a full version video on that. Other people during the live streams are saying, hey, could you explain how these phonological sound change rules in like SCA2 and stuff work, and I just recently released a video talking about a couple sound changers which all use these sound change rules to talk about things. So I figured I'd make a moderately professional looking little presentation on how sound changes work. And again, this is going to be a little bit basic. I'm not going into like super hardcore deep diving stuff, but it should be everything you need to get started. Writing phonological rules. This totally isn't a Google Slides template. Yes, phonological rules. A phonological rule is a way of writing out a sound change, whether it's a phoneme changing over time, or a situation that causes an underlying phoneme to be realized as a more specific allophone. There's a few ways of writing out phonological rules, and several standards that different linguistic institutions and online sound changers use. There's a lot of choices, so I'll be showing you a relatively common way of writing things out. It's somewhere between the SCA2 sound change applier and what I used during my linguistics degree at Arizona State University. It should get the point across, and when you go onto other websites or look at linguistic papers, this should still be enough for you to get the idea of what they're talking about if they use other systems of writing these rules out. So, the basic format is input, output, situation, right? Input turns into the output when a certain situation, a certain context is met. A lot of them use slashes, so I'm going to be using slashes as the default here. Sometimes they put an arrow between input and output. Sometimes it's like input, arrow going over to the right, output, and then situation after a slash. Again, it varies, but this is what I'm going to be using most of the time for this. So here's a little example. If input turns into output when situation is met, we have up here a T, and then we have a slash, and then a flap, slash, and then V underscore V. What does that mean? It means the phoneme ta turns into da when ta is located between two vowels. Now those capital V's don't signify any individual sound, they signify a category of sounds, which we have determined in this situation, V means vowels. It's kind of arbitrary, we're going to get to that. So you're going to start seeing a pattern emerge here as we go through a couple more examples. So here we have ta, or the phoneme ta, turns into a glottal stop when it is before a word boundary. Now what you see there, that's in the situation column, you have an underscore and a hashtag. The underscore is the input and the output. It is the blank position where this variable is happening. The hashtag is representative of a word boundary. It's used most of the time in the sound change appliers, it's used most of the time in actual linguistic fields. The hashtag symbol usually represents a word or syllable boundary, or even like a morphological boundary. Now sometimes the word boundaries are denoted with a $sign. You see that on Lexergy. Sometimes one will be used for word boundaries and another will be used for syllable boundaries or morpheme boundaries or any of that. So there might be situations where it might come in handy to have a $sign and a hashtag, but that's for like really big brain stuff most of the time with allophones and things. Here we have another example. We have ra turning into nothing when it is between a vowel and the letter T, or the phoneme T. So that O with a slash through it, you've probably seen it before, especially if you've done math and stuff. It's the null symbol. It represents something going away. When you have it in a linguistic rule, it represents elision. That sound is gone. The ra suddenly doesn't happen if it's between a vowel and a ta. In a lot of online sound change appliers, they don't use the null, they'll just have it be blank. So like in SCA2, it would be R / capital V underscore T. Means the same thing. Then there's also situations where all you need is an underscore, like this. Say ka turns into ka, in general. It turns into ka. I mean, I have a hard time making that sound. K will turn into Q in all situations. A lot of the times when it doesn't depend on context, they'll just use an arrow. They'll just say K arrow over to Q. A lot of the time when you're showing sound changes over time, you'll have several sets of arrows that just go from one thing to another. Then you have a little bit more specificity in here. Like this one shows that A turns into O before Ka, Ga, Pa, and Wa, right? In linguistics, a lot of the times you're going to write that with the little foldy brackets. I don't know what those things are called. In SCA2, you can use the square brackets for that. You can also put the square brackets in any of the other positions. You could put a set of 4 different sounds in the input. You could put a set of 4 sounds in the output, but they have to line up the right way. So, just a few examples. Again, we were working on the Notion evolution a little while back, and here's some examples of some sound changes that happened in the Notion language between 1600 AR and 2000 AR. So there's a few of these that aren't going to make sense to you yet if you're just learning, but most of them should kind of make sense. You're going to see a lot of capital letters in here, and those are all for categories. Now we're going to talk about these sound categories. These are arbitrary examples, but you can make categories for any sounds that you want. You have consonants. You could have the letter C represent just all consonants. You could have the letter V represent all vowels. You could have N represent all nasals. F for fricatives. You could have something for voiced consonants. I chose D for this one. Again, all of these are arbitrary. I just happened to choose D for this one. I chose D for voiced consonants. I chose E for front vowels, U for back vowels, S for sibilants, Q for uvulars. All of these they're not entirely arbitrary. I chose them for a reason, but again, you can make as many of these as you need to, just for whatever purposes you need in your sound change evolutions. And here's the sound categories that I needed for making the rules for the Notion evolution from 1600 to 2000. So I chose C for all consonants, V for all vowels, B for back vowels, F for front vowels, again, it's arbitrary, S for fricatives, W for labial and labialized consonants, N for nasals, G for voiced consonants, K for voiceless consonants, and then I just chose the letter Q for literally every sound in the language, because there were a couple situations where I needed to ensure that it was that every sound in the language had that rule applied to it. Just make sure you have them defined somewhere so that you don't forget, right? It's really for you more than anything. Or for if it's for a paper or something, make sure you have all those categories defined in the beginning of the paper before you start talking about all these classes like it's obvious, because it's not obvious, it's arbitrary. Then here's one with all categories, right? So V is going to turn into D when it follows a VC pairing. In this situation, I chose to make V, A, E, I, O, U, D, E, U, and C, right? And the order in this matters, right? Because since it says V to D, you need to have the order in the same way, so that A is specifically going to become strut. It's going to go A to A is going to become E is going to become I. Definitely is required in sound change appliers, and it's generally a good idea to do, because you're usually going to have these things listed out right on top of each other. Now, that's not the only way to write out sound change rules. It doesn't have to be individual sounds and then single capital letter classes. You can also write rules with articulation, manner, everything. You can create these binaries. So these rules can be written in terms of their distinctive differences. That's what they generally call them, right? Distinctive differences. And it's usually denoted by stating at least one phonological feature in brackets. It'll usually have either a plus or a minus, though sometimes the plus is just kind of not included, but if it's negative, it'll definitely have a minus. If the feature is active, if you're looking at the example over here on the right, you're looking at pa and ba. They're both consonants, so consonantal is a plus for both of them. If it's inactive or is being made inactive by whatever rule you're writing, it'll be labeled with a minus sign. It'll be negative, right? If you go back to that example, you'll have pa and ba. You have the voiced one, right? Voiced is negative for pa and voiced is positive for ba, because ba is voiced, right? So for example, again, we have here ka turns to ga when it's before the end of a word, right? Before a word boundary. So you could also write that out as plus consonantal minus continuant plus velar minus voiced slash plus voiced slash before a word boundary, and that means the exact same thing as ka turns to ga before a word boundary. It's the same thing. You can use these plus minus conditions to scientifically define your capital letter categories too. If you weren't satisfied with just placing individual phonemes in your capital letter categories, you could literally make them have scientific definitions. You could go ahead and you could say that, oh yeah, N is defined as plus nasal and stuff like that. Here's a couple a couple of the plus minus binaries for sound categories that you can go through. There's consonantal, laminal, coronal, apical, dorsal, syllabic, sonorant, obstruent, voiced, front, back, mid, nasal, labial, labiodental, dental, fricative, affricate, del, rel, plosive, trill, aspirated, rounded, lateral, high, low, anterior, strident, continuant, spread, long, overlong, rising, falling, and there's a ton of others. So, like, if it's a category that causes distinctive differences between two sounds in your language, you can make a plus-minus binary out of it. And the examples that I have on the right are a couple examples. I have a link to the source in the description for all these examples. We have the Latvian underlying vowels, and we have Samoan consonants. So I think it's pretty cool. It just gets pretty advanced. This is stuff that you do with Lexergy on intermediate-ish or advanced-ish mode. So here's a classic one right here. If input turns into output when situation is met, something that is positive voiced, yes voiced, turns into minus voiced, devoiced, voiceless before a word boundary. That would be like ga turning to ka before a word boundary, because those are the only distinctions met. The only difference, hypothetically, between ka and ga is voiced. So once it becomes negative, ga becomes ka. And you can do a couple other things on here too. You could do a couple other variables at a time. This is important. It's pretty specific though. If the specific situation is that a not aspirated and voiced consonant becomes aspirated and not voiced when at the beginning of a word and immediately preceding a vowel, you can write the rule like that. There's other conventions, obviously. There's a lot of other things you can do. I also have a source in the description that shows a lot of those other conventions that you can do, some of which are mentioned in the little picture that I included on the right here. Other sound changes can be represented with rules, though the standards vary widely from institution to institution and from SCA to SCA. So you're basically going to have to look at what rules the linguistic paper or the sound change applier establishes for writing these things down, because after this point things start getting wild. Like you basically just have to do it on a situation to situation basis, find one that you like and then do it that way. Like for example, metathesis, you switch the order of two sounds. The example that I have over to the right shows it as just putting a 1 and a 2 under the sound traits and then having the arrow, and then the output just has those things as 2, 1 instead of 1, 2. But in the SCA squared sound change applier, it would be like category A, category B turns into, and then you just write 2 backslashes and then underscore for all situations. Again, choose what you like best and just do whatever looks the most aesthetic to you. Then there's also some even more advanced stuff that helps you condense these formulas even more. So there's alpha and beta. You might see those in sound change rules sometimes, and it's kind of confusing. It was very confusing to me for a long time, even when we were learning it in school. So the symbols alpha beta are used when the change occurring involves multiple variables. Basically, it's a way of writing two or more rules in a single equation. Save space. Two alphas in an equation would represent two separate changes caused by the same initial conditions, for the sake of saving space and making larger generalizations. But really, like, unless you're writing an official paper, you probably don't need to worry about saving space this much. It basically just puts two different conditions into a single formula. Now, another question that I get a lot is, how do you write allophones with this kind of setup? Because it's pretty similar. I've been showing you phonological shifts, usually used for diachronic shifts, but you can use these rules with pretty much the same format to write allophonic differences within a single phoneme. This is also helpful for defining which allophone in a group is actually the underlying phoneme. So the order matters here, right? So what I have here in this example that I wrote, we have within the phoneme pa, we're going to find out why it's the phoneme pa, but for the phoneme pa, it's released as an aspirated pa word initially. So you can say that pa happens word initially. We have pa turning into an unreleased pa, right, at the end of words. So unreleased pa happens word finally. And then we have pa turns to fa when it is following a vowel that has primary stress in the syllable and before la. Just a random specific one that I made up just for the sake of it. And then pa released as the classic pa elsewhere. Elsewhere is a very important word to think of here. So the sequence above demonstrates the process of finding out which allophone is the underlying phoneme actually. So for the phoneme pa, we have the three situations happening in specific situations, and then pa happens everywhere that does not match any of the other criteria, aka the elsewhere. Even if the elsewhere option happens like very rarely, it's still the underlying form and is thus the defining thing that makes it a phoneme, right? The underlying form is the elsewhere. Now, you might be asking, what if the sounds don't contrast but are definitely part of the same phoneme? There's some specific rules right now here which are pretty important, but basically if the speakers think they're the same phoneme and they don't ever contrast with each other, there's no conflict, then you can just decide that they're part of the same phoneme. And if it's really 50-50, you can even choose which one is the underlying form, which one is the one that defines the phoneme. But that's only if it's really a 50-50 split. If you can't make up any excuse for one of them to be the elsewhere, then you can choose, and you can say that the people have decided that they're part of the same phoneme. But that can only happen if they never conflict with each other, and they happen with relatively the same frequency, right? As it says on the right, they're allophones of a single phoneme if the speakers of that language ignore the difference between the sounds, if the sounds are complementary or non-overlapping, there's no minimal pairs that distinguish the two sounds, and it's predictable which of the sounds will be used in a given context. So there is an answer for that, a definitive answer, and it's just go with it. That's pretty much it. That is a basic look. I've been talking for a while, but that is still a basic look into how phonological rules work, right? So hopefully this has been at least moderately helpful for getting everybody here to understand how phonological rules work, why they're important, what they're used for, and how you can use them for mapping out allophones as well. If you have not yet subscribed, be sure to do so. Help me get to the next big 3,000 subscriber milestone. God, my brain is broken. If you enjoy my content, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon at patreon.com/nguh. That's NGUH, patreon.com/nguh. You'll get Discord benefits if you're a patron for more than 3 months. I will work together with you to make a showcase for your Conlang, where you could suggest video ideas for me. We can be in pretty consistent communication with each other. I love talking to the patrons. I love giving them advice, hanging out with them. It's a great time. I love all my patrons, and it would be great if other people could help me join that too. I will see you on Discord. I'll see you on Minecraft. I'll see you all in the next video. And until then, Nga is out.
An ogodie goardewetos. Nie prahedie faya regu.
How did the picture turn out? Okay. It's literally my light and then a big flash on the screen. Like, you can kind of just barely see me in the background.